1908, Ben Ali Fekar, an Algerian jurist who'd completed his legal education in France, published an article advocating for better political representation for Algerian Muslims in the Revue du Monde Musulman, a specialist publication meant for a primarily French audience. He began by laying out the history of Muslim representation in French Algeria before turning to describe what he called the current system, which he noted strictly limited Algerians' ability to express their needs to the administration, even at the local level. He noted that it was, quote, rather curious to note that the current legislation, which should be more liberal, has shown itself to be far less favorable to the question of indigenous representation than the imperial regime. In other words, the French Republican government had adhered less consistently to liberal principles than the Second Empire of Napoleon III that it had replaced. Fekar concluded by contending that, quote, the liberalism traditional to French politics demanded that the French Republic make large concessions to Algerian Muslims, including the extension of education and the right to vote. Fekar thus mobilized both the specter of the Second Empire and Republicans' ostensible commitment to liberal politics in order to defend his demands to transform the structure of the Algerian colonial administration. Fekar was a member of the Young Algerian Movement, a group of French-educated Algerian Muslims who, in the words of Michel Mann, were, quote, less an organized political party than a small and eclectic, loosely organized network of mutual acquaintances. Few Muslim Algerians had access to a French-style education, but those that had were drawn together first in bilingual sports clubs established during the 1890s, and then after 1901, thanks to the passage of the law that allowed for the free creation of associations in Franco-Muslim cultural circles. The young Algerians were deeply influenced by the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which had, at least initially, sought to create a liberal constitutional government that would revitalize the Ottoman Empire in the face of encroaching European imperial power. They were also perhaps even more directly inspired by the Young Tunisian movement. Most young Algerians did not seek to dismantle the French colonial regime in Algeria, at least during the early 20th century. That said, members of this group took a wide range of positions on Algeria's future and on its relationship to France, which makes them somewhat difficult to generalize about. Many young Algerians consistently expressed their devotion to France, and it seems clear that at least some of them accepted the logic of the civilizing mission that they had learned in French schools. They described themselves as évolué, or as evolved, and they condemned the backwardness of Algerian society while praising the liberalism of France. But even writers who took the most explicitly pro-French positions also condemned the exploitative, authoritarian, and exclusionary political structures beneath which Algerians lived. And they proposed a variety of reforms that they suggested the French Republic should follow if it actually wanted to assimilate Algeria into France and truly transform the territory into an extension of France overseas. And some of them, like Ben Ali Fekar, grounded those demands for political transformation in a particular vision of the relationship between Republican politics and colonial policy that deliberately drew on a long-standing set of French debates about empire, its history, and its relationship with domestic political ideologies. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, empire and its implications had served as a source of debate in French political and intellectual circles. Disagreements about empire stemmed partly from divergent strategies for promoting French national prestige. But these disagreements also resulted from the fact that the very idea of empire had an ambiguous history that was itself bound up in political divisions and turmoil. Different writers, intellectuals, and politicians could use the concept to equally refer to a political system within the hexagon, to a vision of French dominance across Europe, or to the state structure used to rule conquered territory overseas. The term could also invoke the memory of the monarchy's expansion into North America or the Bonapartist expansion across the continent, as well as the specter of German unification or British overseas conquest. The nature of empire's relationship to republicanism, Bonapartism, French national identity, and colonial expansion was thus both shifting and fraught. The multiple valences of empire during this period, moreover, had both political and intellectual consequences. They played an important role in shaping the ways that intellectuals, writers, and politicians articulated their ideas about France's political organization, its national identity, and its colonial ambitions. The memory of both Napoleonic empires lay at the center of these tangled understandings of empire during the early Third Republic. The vividness of these memories owed much to Napoleon III, who throughout his reign sought to provide shape and substance to his imperial regime by associating himself with his uncle and by popularizing sometimes contradictory theories of empire. In the early years of his rule, Napoleon III usually described empire as an internal form of political organization that drew on the legacy of the revolution, but tempered that legacy with the promise of order and security. He thus treated the French Empire as functionally equivalent to the French nation. But in the 1860s, Napoleon III began to focus more on France's overseas territories. He extended France's investment in Indochina, tried to expand France's foothold in North America by creating an allied Latin empire in Mexico, and sought to reimagine Algeria as a Royaume Arabe or Arab kingdom. In Mexico and in Algeria especially, Napoleon III paired this renewed overseas investment with a more comprehensive vision of empire. This understanding operated somewhat differently in Mexico and in Algeria, but in both cases, Napoleon III posited empire as not only a specific kind of political system within France, but also as a way of organizing overseas territory. This model, which proved deeply unpopular in Mexico, Algeria, and in France, thus merged continental or domestic empire with colonial empire, if not necessarily in an equal way. The legacy of Napoleon III's understandings of empire was problematic for Republicans in the early years of the Third Republic. France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War had tarnished Bonapartism generally, and Napoleon III in particular, in the eyes of much of the population. Despite its brief duration, the conflict left France territorially dismembered and in debt to Germany, and it also brought about a political revolution and a subsequent civil war that left deep internal divisions. In the wake of this destruction, numerous popular publications and much of the press came to associate the very word empire with weakness, effeminacy, decadence, internal strife, and defeat. Indeed, the Republican government that came to power in the wake of 1870 to 71 defended its legitimacy by defining itself explicitly against the imperial government that preceded it. As the Republicans embarked on their own overseas empire-building project in the years that followed, the ambiguity of empire and its reference therefore became increasingly troubling, especially since Republicans' political opponents often made use of the ambiguities inherent in Republicanism's relationship to empire when they criticized Republican-driven colonial expansion. Questions about the relationship between continental and colonial empire thus intersected with and complicated Republicans' attempts to solidify their political platforms. My wider book project focuses on these debates over the meaning of empire in both Second Empire and early Third Republic France, zeroing in specifically on how Republicans after 1871 struggled to redefine empire, free it from its Napoleonic legacy, and justify their colonial ambitions. And as we all know, this project was on the whole successful. By the early decades of the 20th century, the colonial empire became widely accepted across most levels of French society. But when I read this article by Fécard in 1908, I was struck by how he, nearly 40 years after the fall of the Second Empire, specifically invoked the specter of Napoleonic imperialism to criticize the Republican colonial administration in Algeria. And I decided to write about the young Algerians in my conclusion as a way of thinking through both the afterlives of these debates about empire in the early 20th century and the question of who was and was not able to directly participate in them. This conference paper reflects the beginnings of that work. So in the second half of this paper, I'll talk a bit about the dynamics that characterize debates over colonial and continental empire in Algeria more specifically, and reflect on how the young Algerians sought to make use of those debates in order to formulate their political demands. So debates over the relationship between empire and republic were especially complicated in Algeria because Napoleon III had treated the territory as the centerpiece for his vision of an empire that would rest on Bonapartist principles and bind multiple nations together beneath one imperial structure at home and abroad. On a discursive, if not on a practical or effective level, he thus transformed Algeria into a centerpiece example of Bonapartist imperial strategy. And in the early years of the Third Republic, European settlers in Algeria, who on the whole had detested the Royaume Arabe, were able to make use of the Metropolitan Republicans campaign to discredit Bonapartist empire in order to demand the reshaping of Algeria in a way that suited their own ambitions. So they argued that a Republican Algeria would not be a colony at all, let alone an Arab nation tied to France through a wider imperial structure as Napoleon III had proposed. Instead, it would be an extension of France across the Mediterranean. At the same time, they pressed the metropolitan government to pass laws that marginalized Algeria's indigenous populations and made it easier for colonists to claim their land, partly by associating protections for indigenous Algerian communities with the government of Napoleon III. The settlers' campaign was on the whole successful. They owed at least some of their success to the fact that the interim government needed their support, and it was distracted by the events unfolding in the metropole, like the Paris Commune. But colonists' ability to demand reforms also stemmed from the way that they had mobilized Republican anti-imperial discourse. So they argued that Algeria would only be truly Republican when it adopted a civil administration, highlighting the connections between Algeria's military administration and the Second Empire. And as other scholars have shown, they also deliberately drew on the language of assimilation to defend their demands, which was popularly associated with revolutionary and Republican traditions. Most settler politicians and writers made it clear that this assimilation would only apply to the territory of Algeria and to the European settlers who lived there. They were less clear on the position that indigenous Algerians would occupy in this new assimilated state, although most contended that Algerians should be forced to assimilate to French cultural and social norms without having access to French political rights, at least temporarily. The embrace of assimilation also promised concrete benefits for Republican politicians in France. Supporting settlers' demands potentially offered the embattled Republicans much-needed support in the National Assembly in the 1870s, and on a more theoretical level, by accepting settlers' contention that they were the primary population in Algeria, and by granting them additional political rights, Republicans could claim to have transformed the colony, removing the Second Empire's despotic systems and replacing them with more democratic ones, much as they sought to transform the metropole. And then finally, assimilating Algeria into the metropole obfuscated Algeria's relationship to empire by positioning the territory as a constitutive part of the national body. Republicans could thus distance the territory from Napoleon III's vision of a multinational Mediterranean empire. This vision of an assimilated Algeria nevertheless was marked by uncertainty. It remained unclear exactly how and to what degree Algeria would be able to assimilate into France. And the position of the indigenous population in this newly assimilated Algeria also remained deliberately ambiguous. Settlers' ability to defend this reading of empire and republicanism in Algeria was partly tied up in the fact that for much of the second half of the 19th century, it was structurally difficult for most Muslim Algerians to participate in French debates over empire and Algeria's future. And this was true even if they could speak French. The public sphere that these debates emerged in was expanding in the late 19th century, but it was far from a neutral space where anyone could speak. It remained exclusive, hierarchical, contested, and fractured by both geography and political party. In the early Third Republic, settlers were particularly well positioned to promote their ideas about empire and republicanism thanks to their close ties with metropolitan Republican politicians. Muslim Algerian voices, on the other hand, were even more thoroughly marginalized during the Third Republic than they had been during the Second Empire. And in fact, French Republicans and settlers alike invoked the minimal influence of a handful of Algerian elites over Bonapartist colonial policy as evidence of Napoleonic rule's militarism, decadence, and infatuation with aristocracies, all political problems that these writers promised the new republic would solve in both France and in Algeria. As Arthur Asaraf has explained, these patterns of exclusion were formalized in the 1881 laws on the Indigenat and on freedom of the press, which together created a system, quote, in which French citizens could publish freely, while Muslims were forbidden not only from publishing, but even from speaking, assembling, and moving around Algeria. Partly as a result of these laws, combined with the collapse of Algerian education systems under French rule, there were relatively few newspapers and publishing houses where Algerian writers could publish their ideas, even in French, let alone in Arabic. Bilingual newspapers did exist, but they usually functioned either as mouthpieces for the government or they were quickly shut down by the colonial administration. That said, over the 1890s, and especially in the early 20th century, a number of Algerian Muslim newspapers at least briefly emerged. These newspapers usually had somewhat limited circulation, but they provided a new platform for Algerian writers and reformists. In their writing, the young Algerians sought to challenge both the reading of the relationship between republicanism and empire defended by settler communities in Algeria, and the structure of the debates about empire themselves, which had been designed to exclude them. So like the settlers before them, who had reached out to Republicans in the metropole to oppose Napoleon III's Royaume Arabe, the young Algerians sought to build alliances across the Mediterranean with indigenophile politicians and intellectuals who were critical of the colonists' hegemony in Algeria. These attempts at alliance building also reflected the fact that many young Algerians thought that it was unlikely that the local colonial administration, which they saw as beholden to entrenched settler interests, would even listen to their proposed reforms. So they sought to publish in French publications, they wrote petitions to the national government, and they even sent delegations to the metropole in order to explain their proposed reforms. And in 1912 in particular, after the government extended military recruitment to include Muslims in Algeria, a young Algerian delegation went to Paris and met with Théodore Stigue, the Minister of the Interior, Georges Clemenceau, and Raymond Poincaré. And there they invoked the idea of the Republican citizen of arms to demand that this new military service should be accompanied by citizenship rights. So to some extent, given their intended audience, the young Algerians' argumentative strategies are perhaps unsurprising. They positioned themselves as good Republicans, deeply devoted to France and its political ideas, and they focused their criticism on both the settler community and on the colonial administration, which they maintained did not live up to those principles. So they sought to get people in metropolitan France on their side, partly by not directing their criticisms directly at them. But at the same time, their attacks on the colonial regime in Algeria also threw the relationship between republicanism and empire back into question. In the 1870s, French Republicans had sought to distance themselves from the Second Empire's regime in both France and in Algeria, right, which they had described as despotic and decadent and effeminate, by creating a republican regime that they defined in opposition to the Second Empire, even if in practice they actually borrowed from the empire's policies. But in 1908, in the article that I began this paper with, Ben Ali Fekar directly questioned this idea. Far from eliminating the vestiges of the Second Empire's despotism, he maintained the Republicans had only managed to create an imperial system that was even more autocratic than the one that it had replaced. And on top of that, he argued because the French had not sought to assimilate Algeria's Muslim populations, it had failed to assimilate Algeria itself, which remained bound to France through an imperial system. Even young Algerian thinkers who did not directly invoke the legacy of the Second Empire consistently pointed towards this apparent disconnect between the Republic's professed political principles and the structure of imperial rule in Algeria, questioning, for example, whether, quote, the French nation that has sacrificed so much to bring foreigners the ideas of liberty, justice, and civilization could deny their most basic benefits to a people whom fate has placed beneath its tutelary wing. In a widely reproduced speech, Amir Khaled, the grandson of Abd el-Kader, noted that, quote, one could not seriously say that the policies towards indigenous communities were rooted in very Republican theories. At the same time, he maintained, he could not believe that France, which, quote, exported its ideas to other countries, would limit its liberalism to its European territory. The authors of these accounts did not contend that it was impossible to square French imperial rule with Republican principles, and they did not position empire itself as the problem, but they maintained that there was nothing Republican about French rule in Algeria, and they implied that if France did not extend its Republican principles to the territory, the state would remain hypocritically in violation of its own endorsed positions. So they did implicate metropolitan France in the structure of Algeria's future, even if they blamed the settlers and the colonial administration for its present form. The young Algerian campaigns received relatively favorable coverage in the French press in the years leading up to World War I, perhaps reflecting the success of the young Algerian strategy of distinguishing between the colonial administration's practices in Algeria and the ideals of French republicanism. But even though the young Algerian delegation was received warmly by senior government officials in 1912, neither the national government nor the colonial administration actually followed through on any of the young Algerians' proposed reforms. As Michelle Mann has suggested, this failure partly reflected the distance between the position of the young Algerians, who wanted the government to immediately extend real rights to Muslim Algerians, and the position of their allies in Paris, who still believed that those rights should be deferred to some unspecified future point. It may have also reflected the fact that even if the specter of Napoleonic imperialism could still be invoked to embarrass the Republican regime in the early 20th century, Republicans had sufficiently discursively disaggregated continental and overseas empire, at least in their own minds, and they no longer worried that imperial despotism overseas would threaten Republican rule at home. Thank you.